Well, the rabbis used to say that they enjoyed studying the Bible as much as a dog enjoyed gnawing on a really good juicy bone to get every last bit of marrow out of it. They loved a good scriptural challenge. So no doubt this very confusing parable of the unjust steward or dishonest manager in this translation gave the Pharisees who were listening to Jesus a whole lot to chew on. I had to read that last verse because I thought it was important to notice that Luke says they were even moved to ridicule Jesus at the end of it. They essentially spit out this parable and refused to even think any more about it. For us, too, this parable is a pretty tough chunk of meat to choke down. Jesus seems to be endorsing some very questionable business practices, even dishonesty, maybe even embezzlement. And no preacher or commentator I've read seems to be very happy with this parable either. From the Geneva Bible Notes of John Calvin and his friends, to modern pastors who I read this week scratching their heads over it on the internet. One modern commentator, Brian Peterson, wrote, "Trying to find a moral in this apparently amoral story has embarrassed interpreters since the ancient church. Perhaps it even embarrassed Luke, since he seems to add several different conclusions, as if looking for a fitting lesson." My favorite comment, though, came from an anonymous pastor online who in his blog entry wrote, "There are just too many things in that parable that cannot be said aloud in church." I don't know about you, but I'm preaching on the psalm. No one really has time to write or listen to a sermon that could untangle all the knots in this parable's twisted logic. Even Luke has Jesus offer 4 slightly different stabs at moral interpretation, which actually most historical Jesus scholars are not sure that Jesus actually did. Jesus more typically seemed to enjoy leaving the meaning of his parables hanging, with those open-mouthed Pharisees who were listening just twisting in the wind. So, here's your quiz for today. Is this parable about A, whoever is faithful in a little is faithful in much, and whoever is dishonest in a little is dishonest in much? Or B, if you have not been faithful with ill-gotten gain, who will trust you with true riches? Or C, if you cannot be trusted with somebody else's things, who will give you things of your own? Or D, no one can serve both God and wealth. Well, in this sermon, I've decided we're going to go with answer E, none of the above. I want to make a case for forgiveness as the moral of this story. Here's the thing. We first need to look at this parable of Jesus in the context of Luke's gospel and in the context of the times they lived in, not in our own context. We are likely to assume that the rich man that begins the parable is the good guy here. Most of us are comfortable, hardworking, law-abiding, middle-class people. We're likely to feel sorry for the business owner that he is stuck with this dishonest manager. It's hard to get good employees you can trust. And business fraud is, after all, a crime. But let's look at Luke's context, where he places it in his story. What follows immediately after this parable in the 16th chapter of Luke is the story of poor man Lazarus. You remember that one? The beggar who sat under the table and the rich man ignored him while he ate the scraps that the dogs left behind. Lazarus dies and he goes to heaven, but the rich man burns in hell. We learned a story in Vacation Bible School that was, dip your finger in the water, come and cool my tongue, for I'm tormented in the flame. It was the song of the rich man. Jesus is no friend of rich people. And the parable directly before this one is the prodigal son, where the son who runs away and spends a whole fortune in reckless living is the one rewarded by the loving father. The same phrase used for the offense of the so-called dishonest manager is the one that is used for the prodigal son's offense. Each is accused of squandering property that is not technically his own to squander. We can't help but sympathize, I think, with the hardworking older brother who gets no fancy party, who just resents the unfairness of the whole thing. Let's face it, it is unfair. And the role of God is this forgiving father who doesn't even wait for the prodigal son to apologize, but instead runs down the road and throws his arms around the boy to hug and to kiss him. It's an embarrassing public display of an old fool's forgiveness of a young fool's mismanagement of hard-earned money. Parables are supposed to shake things up, though, especially to upset those who are self-righteous and powerful, like the Pharisees. Marcus Borg, the author of Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time and other books on Jesus, likes to talk of Jesus as an upsetter of what he calls conventional wisdom. So this parable starts to make a lot more sense if we can just get out of the mindset that the rich man has to be played by God. I had a professor who thought the parable of the prodigal son would be better called the parable of the forgiving father, because that puts the emphasis where it belongs. So perhaps we should call this parable from Luke 16 not the parable of the dishonest manager, but rather the parable of the irresponsibly generous debt forgiver. Jesus is saying, it's not God who's unfair, it's life itself. It's the kingdoms of this world that are unfair. So choose life in God's realm of love instead. It's our worldly system of moral accounting that I believe is under attack here, not the individuals caught up in it like the poor manager struggling to survive. Remember, it never presents any evidence in this parable that the dishonest manager did anything wrong. In fact, the rich man who owns the business just kind of summarily dismisses him. He says, "Give me an accounting of your work, and by the way, you're fired." There's not much grace in that story. So one commentator pointed out what we translate as dishonest manager might be better or more literally translated from the Greek as manager of unrighteousness. And what we hear translated as dishonest wealth might be better translated as the coin of this present and unrighteous realm. The gospel of Jesus Christ is about God's economic system, which is a system entirely different from our own. This parable is perplexing precisely because there is no exchange rate that makes any sense between the realm of God and the empire of Caesar. We proclaim God is a just ruler, but let's face it, the facts of life show that bad things happen all the time to perfectly good people. God, like any human parent who tries to mediate sibling arguments, has never been able to be exactly and precisely fair. And when you think about it, we all should be grateful for that. God acts like a reckless spendthrift when it comes to dispensing grace. He just gives it away to any fool who asks for it. Any fool, even us. I believe Jesus cast the rich business owner in this parable as the bad guy because, like the Pharisees, he is an accountant of righteousness, as we are when we nitpick over the sins of our neighbors, when we are so focused on the speck in our neighbor's eye that we can't see the log in our own. I remember interviewing my great aunts for a family history project, and they were wonderful women, but they could still remember which sister got the best doll on Christmas 1906. Aren't we all like that, deep down? But we assume the rich man must be the hero of the story because Jesus puts him in charge. But think about it, who was actually in charge during those days, during the time Jesus was preaching? Caesar.